Morning.
Morning.
The so it's interesting. I was in one of the articles about this uh, document by the early reformers, very early, talking about 1815. It's interesting. Somebody makes the point that you know, I mean, when you read this book, you realize these are real chachamim. Like they have a tremendous amount of halachic knowledge and Talmudic knowledge. Uh, you know, they write. You read this, and there's not a lot of difference between reading this and a mainstream responsa by a 19th century posek. In terms of the language and the command of sources and Talmudic knowledge. Obviously, early reform emerges out of, or it's a way of, for lack of a better term, Orthodox Jews dealing with the Enlightenment. I think I can't emphasize enough that it just feels to me so different than me. I don't think you can just take like kind of the boundaries and definitions of today, Orthodox, and Reform, and cast it back 200 years. And it's just so different. And somebody made the point that, in a certain way, this is called Reform. It's called Reformation, but Reformation, which is about trying to put yourself in line with earlier sources, trying to sort of figure out, what do the traditional sources really want from us, is not Reformation. I mean, I guess you could also argue that that's not true, but it's, in a way, what I mean, the sense that you get is that they are totally arguing from halacha. That's what they're concerned about, halacha. It's not like they've, gotten rid of halacha. It almost feels like in the very early days of reform, and you can judge for yourself. I mean, we'll look at some of this, but when you read, I mean, this is like, in a way, the book of very early reform halachic argument about creating the movement, and it feels a lot more like sort of left and right within Orthodoxy arguing with each other. That's how it seems to me. To like how that would be today. What does the halacha want of us, and how much within halacha can you be part of the world? It's not like they're arguing. It's so different than sort of reform today, in which, let's say, reform might argue, we don't think we're bound by Jewish law. We think the places where the prophets write about the importance of interpersonal law, and they downplay ritual law. That's the true Judaism. That's not at all what we're seeing here. In 1815. I mean, just so in 1880, just so different. First of all, they're writing to poskim. In the first part of the book is three responses, basically, from more mainstream poskim. There's certainly people, for lack of a better term, on the left of Orthodoxy. And then the second part of the book, which is quite long, it's 100 pages, is by this author, whose name is the second part's called Or Noga, and Eliezer Lieber. Now there's some question about kind of what happened to him. I don't know if it's true, but there does seem to be there's some opinion that he seems to kind of have disappeared. Doesn't seem like he became that well known as sort of a foundation for reform. There was some theory that maybe he became, but I think it pays to see some of his language. As an example, just of a very knowledgeable, very early reformer, who is writing from a place, right? The default position is not reform like it is today. The default position is orthodox. Is so this is the introduction to the first part of the book, which is mostly these three shuvot responsa, one of which we saw the other day. But this is the introduction. So it says, I guess in a way, this is more like early conservative. That you take conservative in the early part of the 20th century. These are great Talmidei Chachamim. Was it Shul Lieberman was offered to be the chief rabbi of Israel before he of course, they're arguing from a religious, halakha. That's what I think. He says, I'm writing this because I want to get input from my colleagues because I am, of small knowledge. He says, my main issue in this book is, can you use instruments in shul? Not just instruments, but organo, Lashon Ashkenaz, argal, the German word argal, an organ. In other words, that's interesting. As he says, this whole book, basically, the main issue is the organ. That's what we need. Now, it's interesting. Rabbi Shamshon Raphael Hirsch did have certain, for lack of a better term, reformations like the choir and robes, but he did not have an organ, even though, again, there was some argument of organs. But I guess an organ, and I've said this before, is somehow the thing. It's the thing that it seems like in 18, that's the thing that makes you a modern person. It's a little hard for us to relate to. And I say that this organ is what's mentioned in Tehillim, in Psalms. And there are those who want to argue with me. What's the argument against this? That the Christians play it in their temple, in their churches. Oh, and that would be a problem. And there's another issue, which is that we don't play instruments after the destruction of the temple. So what is Mahu Hadin Bazeh Halacha Lamase? Right, here's the way he puts it. What is the halacha? That's what he wants to know. For us, that's not a reform question. But for them, that is. And I would say, I don't know what the question is. It's clear to me that it's permitted. And, we don't even have to discuss it. She says, when the rabbis made the decree that you shouldn't play instruments today because of the destruction of the temple, it's interesting. It's not just the imitation of the non-Jew, which is what the Orthodox folks really stress. But there was this big question of, can you play instruments at all after destruction? So he says that they forbade instruments just in frivolity, in the Beit HaMishte, in the tavern. As it says in Sota, Mishabatla Sanhedrin, Batla Shir Beis HaMishte. When the Sanhedrin was nullified, meaning when the exile came, so no longer was music allowed in the drink. It says, Bashir lo yishtu yayin. In song, do not drink wine. In other words, when it's combined with wine and frivolity for secular purpose, so that's what was forbidden because of the Zimra. There's another proof that you shouldn't have instruments after the destruction. Rashi says, both Zimra, Gzeral, but they says that only applies in drinking. That's only when it's kalut rosh, when it's done for frivolity. But if it's not done for frivolity, like in our case, when it's done l'shem mitzvah, we're doing it for a mitzvah, to make men and women and children happy who come to the shul to hear, let's say, for a mitzvah. So that's serving God. As it says, Ivdu es Hashem b'simcha, serve God with joy. Of course, he needs instruments. Therefore, it seems you certainly can sing, he says, and you certainly can use instruments. Ashrei Adam Shemei Elo, and happy is the one And he says it's an obligation. It's actually, if you say that this is the way we serve God with joy, maybe it's an obligation. As it says, if you don't serve God with joy, that's why the destruction comes. And this is about praising God, as Maharan Hagon Mahari Kara said. He quotes Machaber, the author of the Shulchan Aruch. He says in Orachayim Tafkuf Samach, Kvar Nogu Kol Yisrael Lomar Divrei Tishbachot Shir Shalodot. He says there's a halacha that when you want to praise God, you should do it over wine. It comes from the Gemara. Tzimala Agon Moran and the Ramah, Rabbi Moshe Isserlis agrees. And tzarich mitzvah, and he says, and he adds that for a mitzvah, like a chatan and kala, like for a wedding, that you should certainly do it over wine. So if you say that for the honor of human beings, permitting this kind of joy and wine and music, certainly you should do that for a mitzvah. Kal v'chomer for God, certainly a 40-yard tree for God. We see this in Rashi also. He brings different sources for this, to prove basically, right? He goes in the direction, not so much right here of Christianity, but the direction of can you have instruments after the destruction? And he argues that you can for a mitzvah. And that makes a lot of sense. It's definitely a mainstream argument. And he says, why do we have to, go into these things? It's so obvious. We can see that that's the halacha. That for kavod Shabbat, you should be able to have music instruments. After these ideas, I've proved that if it's for the sake of heaven, you're certainly allowed to use instruments. So now we come to our question. Mutter l'nagin b'kli zeh, hainu b'min kli zeh mer, zeh hamayuchad lehem l'goyim. Can you use, now he says, the question is, can you use an instrument that is set aside, that is particular to the non-Jew and what is used in the church? Or is that going in their chokim? Is that going in their ways? And he says, I don't think that's a problem either. Because and here he's using kind of the ideas of Shik a little bit. He says, just because the non-Jew does something doesn't make it forbidden for us. It's very clear to me, the Torah did not forbid everything the non-Jew does. There's no reason for that. But to play this instrument, so he says, why should we? So he says, but playing the organ, going, there's a good. It's not cloak. It's not that there's no reason. The only reason we're doing it is to be like the non-Jew. He says there's a very good reason for playing an organ in the synagogue. You do it ashir v'chol kli hashir mor le'adam samcho. He says song and instruments inspire us. That's why we're doing it. It has a very good reason. Remember, the Maram Shik had said, if it has a reason, then it's not imitation of the non-Jew. It's not forbidden as chukot hagoyim. It's just an imitation of the non-Jew. And this is what people do when they're sad. They play instruments. This inspires people. And he says, therefore, there should be nothing wrong with playing instruments to give joy to the people who hear them. This is for God. Quotes the Maharik that we saw, that if it has a reason, it's okay. So far, pretty good halachic arguments, I think. So he says the second issue is it, now of course here's where kind of the rubber meets the road. Is this chukot hanachrim? Is this chukot hagoyim? Is this walking in the way of the non-Jew? Okay. Lefi hanal, anir l'anistaiti. He says, it appears to me, sheshayach bo pritzat derech hatzniut v'ha'anava. He says, the Maharik here, he's quoting, that if it's something that either is done for no reason, like superstition, and you're just doing it to be like a non-Jew, or if it's a breach of tzniut, of of modesty and humility. So those are the factors, the Marik had said, that make it, and the Marik was an accepted Haredi, saying, and a student of the Sam Sofer, and that is what makes it walking in the way of the non-Jew. And the example over there in the Gemara is just because they wear purple, so I'm going to wear purple. And that was considered not sneak, not modest. And that would be there have to be two factors there. Number one has to be a breach of tzniut, has to be a breach of modesty, and it has to be in order to be like that. There's antaresa divrei gadol. So he says, in our situation, it's not about pritsuit. There's no lack of modesty here. Therefore, it's not walking in their way. This is not playing an instrument. Is not a lack. Now, if the non-Jew is doing something new, just that's uniquely non-Jewish, okay, then I understand. But this is something Jews have done. This is a Jewish thing that the non-Jew took on. That's an interesting argument, right? We used to play instruments in the temple. It's not like this isn't Jewish. This is very Jewish. Just because a non-Jew starts doing it, we can't do it anymore. That doesn't make any sense. It's a good argument. Now, maybe if you want to say that we can't do it in the synagogue because the Levites did it, and it's going to look like we have a temple, that's not a problem either. And he says ours is not exactly the kind they used. So they, in the temple, he quotes the Rambam that they only used a wheel, a wind instrument, a harp, but that it really was not. He brings another proof that you can use the things that they use. He says, Kol ha'olam mikol ha'ktav, what comes out of everything I've written is mutar l'shar l'nagim b'shir b'eshem. You're allowed to use instruments in shul if it's for the honor of the Torah and for God. L'dvar mitzvah l'gazal chazal. The rabbis didn't, have a problem with that. It's not imitating the non-Jew. And what's going to happen? It's going to be very positive. People are going to come to shul to pray, men and women, and they're going to, because of the instruments, they like it. And as it says, the rabbi said, a person should always try to do things, even if it's not for the right reasons. If you do it for the wrong reasons, you'll come to do it for the right reasons. That's it. I haven't heard that argument, by the way, in this whole question. But he's saying, okay, so they're going to come for the music. If they'll come for the music, they'll start to come to daven also. Very interesting. Now, he doesn't distinguish here between Shabbos and weekday. I assume what he's thinking is to have a non-Jew, which again, there is precedent. Okay, and then he says, so why is he bringing these poskim here, these three poskim? So he says, he says, I've written this question to the Rabbi of Livorno, Rabbi Chaim Yosef ben Salmon, and the great rabbi, these three great rabbis. And then he's going to have haskamos, which is approbation. Let's see who it's from. By Aaron Cohen Kachli. Yehuda. That'll be interesting to see where the haskam is from. By Yitzchak Ordov. I'm going to try and figure out who these approbations are from. That's going to be very important. Who does he find to give him an approbation? It's clearly known as a reform, as a reformist. That's true for sure. Even though it might seem to us very traditional because of where we're coming from, believe me, some Sofer was up in arms. Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good day.